Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is it's August. Oh, it's finally August. It's August 2nd. We made it through yet another month of 2020. And I've got a very exciting show for you guys today, because today I'm going to be focusing on guilty pleasures, which is just a fun topic overall, I think. So the first movie I'm going to be talking about is one of Netflix's newest releases, which is The Kissing Booth 2. Then I'm going to talk about a first-time watch for me, my weekly watch, which was 10 Things I Hate About You, something I've been wanting to watch for a good long time. And then my weekly recommendation is a little strange. A lot of people probably won't agree with me because it's a guilty pleasure, but mine is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And finally, we're going to cap off this wonderfully weird episode with my top 5 guilty pleasures of all time, saving, of course, Amazing Spider-Man 2. So that's the episode, and let's get into it. Alright, so The Kissing Booth 2 is a sequel to 2018's The Kissing Booth. It stars Joey King, Jacob Elordi, and Joel Courtney, and it follows Elle in her senior year of high school as she navigates her long-distance relationship with her boyfriend Noah, as well as her semi-codependent best friend relationship with Lee back at home. So, I wouldn't say I was excited for this movie, but I was definitely curious. I had seen The Kissing Booth back in 2018, and I can say that I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a great movie by any means, but I don't think it's what anybody's signing up for. I don't think anybody's going into this thinking it's going to be the best movie of all time. It's just a fun, goofy laugh with some friends. It's a fun group watch. And so I was curious to see what they were going to go with the plot right off the bat. And I have to say that I wish this movie was a lot more fun than it was. I wish this movie was a lot better than it was. I don't think it's very good. And I just ultimately think that it was taking itself a bit too seriously, and I would have wanted to just have some more fun while watching this movie. So right off the bat, it's 2 hours and 12 minutes, which I didn't actually check what The Kissing Booth is. So let's see. The Kissing Booth is 1 hour 45, which is a lot tighter. I also think the plot of The Kissing Booth is a lot more laid out. Like, it's laid out a lot more directly. The plot of The Kissing Booth 2 doesn't really seem to have any coherence to it. So it basically starts, there's a couple different plots that kind of move on throughout the story, and then they get resolved very quickly within like 30 minutes, and then we're on to a brand new plot, and they all kind of intersect at the end. But nothing has the emotional stakes that you would want them to. Everything kind of intersects, but the things that you would expect to be really big don't end up being that big of a deal as far as like interpersonal relationships go. So the movie, just right off the bat, is way too long. It doesn't need to be nearly that long. Everyone is kind of in for like a fun teen romance movie that can be kind of silly and schlocky and dumb. And instead it's 2 hours and 10 minutes, and it kind of drudges on in a lot of scenes. A lot of those plots could be cut out. I think a lot of those subplots could be cut out too. There's a couple different character subplots with characters that we're not really invested in. There was one particular subplot between a friend of Elle's where he starts to have a crush on another guy, and it just didn't seem to serve any narrative purpose. I didn't even realize who the guy was. I don't even think that he was a main character in the first movie or in it at all. So there's a couple side plots that are like that. that definitely could have been on the cutting room floor because they just don't serve any actual purpose in the story and only set to make things just a little bit slower, and the pacing ends up suffering because of it. And a lot of the events that happen, like I said, because they are things that happen they like happen and then they get resolved in 20 minutes, the entire movie really could have gotten resolved in 20 minutes. I know that, of course, teenagers are going to be petty and non-communicative and whatnot, but no one talks to anybody, and because the movie is just so predictable in the first place, it all ends up just becoming very frustrating. Additionally, there's no actual arc for the story at hand. Some characters go through minor character arcs, but the actual story relatively starts and ends in the exact same place. And the relationship between the characters are almost exactly the same, which is definitely frustrating because that's not what you watch a movie for. I will say that a lot of those subplots, or a lot of just the main plots that seem to be dispersed throughout it, do come back fairly nicely towards the end of the film, but there's almost 3 different scenes that feel like a climax, and the middle one that takes place at Thanksgiving feels like that's where everything is intersecting in a way, but everything gets blown off very quickly. None of those intersections really have any lasting emotional consequences because it tends to I think it happens with 25 minutes left in the movie, so we just don't get any time to sit and experience the consequences of these actions. So no one really gets their comeuppance. And although you wouldn't necessarily want a main character to, you definitely want a main character to grow and learn. And the other thing is that a lot of these main characters are fairly unlikable. So this will kind of segue us into the acting section, but both Elle and Lee are fairly selfish and manipulative, and because they don't go through that arc throughout the movie, you never end up wanting to like them or rooting for them in general. There's also a character that is a new character and is a main character for most of the film named Marco, Marco or Marcus? This movie is, honestly, I was trying to recount this movie to my friend. So I watched this movie last night, mind you. So I'm recording this, it's like 24 hours ago. And 2 hours after watching the movie, an hour after watching the movie, I was trying to recount the plot to my friends, and just based on the fact that there are so many different things going on and it's so long, I couldn't even get halfway through. And then it's also somewhat forgettable because of that. Yeah, Marco. Okay, I was right. I'm good. I'm fine. So Marco is a main character who is actually fairly likable, and I like his character. I like the actor. And he doesn't seem to serve any purpose in the story. He exists and then he doesn't. And I think that, they've signed on for a Kissing Booth 3, but it just seems like a lot of these character moments and these character subplots are fairly pointless to the story, and a lot of them should have been on the cutting room floor. And it could have made the movie a tight hour and a half, and it would have made it a lot more enjoyable. Because a lot of those scenes go on because you know the outcome of the scene, because it's also a fairly predictable movie. I didn't say that up front, but most of what happens you can predict either at the beginning of each scene or within the first 10 minutes of the movie. But each scene, because you kind of know the outcome or expecting the outcome, it drags on longer. So although the pacing between scenes might be fairly tight, so this is kind of going into editing. I know I'm skipping around here a little bit. But the pacing within the scene is fairly poor. So moving on to the acting, Joey King is the lead here. I've seen Joey King in a lot of stuff because she's a fairly relevant actor within my generation. She's been in a lot of stuff for what I've grown up with, and I think she's a very talented actress. In this movie in particular, though, I don't think she's at her strongest. And I kind of credit that because of the fact that there's a lot of highs and lows in this movie between the characters. It's high school. Things are going to go up and down fairly frequently. And because there's so many different things going on in this movie, things go up frequently. And I just don't think her acting is intense enough in this. So the high highs are not high enough. The low lows are not low enough. None of it feels very motivated from an internal aspect, and so I just don't think there's enough intensity within this movie. And I think part of that, it might be acting, it might be directing, is because this movie seems to be wanting to ground itself a bit more in realism than the last one. There are some stylistic choices that sort of reject that thesis, but overall, a lot of the character moments I think are trying to be a lot more realistic, and because of that, the movie ends up taking itself a bit too seriously, and all of the performances realistically want to be a little bit more grounded, I think, than the first one, because the first one was just so, just the character relationships were so silly and crazy and intense, that this one is a bit more grounded, and so maybe the performances are a little bit more like dialed back, but I just don't think that works, for the tone of the story. Moving on to the production design, I really would have wanted this movie to be a bit more over the top. I think this movie could have been quite good, actually, if it had leaned into how absurd it is, just from a plot standpoint and ultimately a marketing standpoint. The first movie got really popular online because of the fact that it was just so silly and weird and juvenile, and I think that a lot of people watched it to make fun of it or laugh with it or whatever and talk about it in a group. And so it became a pretty big discussion point as far as like Netflix films go. And I wish that it had the sequel, I wish that it had leaned into that a bit more, and like been a bit sillier even. And those stylistic choices happen maybe more frequently or just a little bit more coherently because of the fact that they're so all over the place and don't even match each other. Therefore, they don't match the more grounded aspects of the film. I wish that they had just leaned into that even more and made everything a bit more over the top. And so with that production design, a lot of everything feels just a little bit dull, much like those performances. I think that there's no real variety in the costuming. Everyone kind of has their thing that they wear, and then just like varying versions of that. And then there's no eccentricity or just even differences in their clothing. Like, obviously most characters in most films have a color associated with them or a color palette or whatnot, and so most apparent for Elle, because she's in pretty much every scene of this film, is sort of like a yellow striped shirt and blue jeans, and it just doesn't move from that. I wish that they had kind of like worked a little bit more interestingly within those confines. So there's just not very much variety in the costuming. The colors in general are not very, like, they're all just kind of like mold into the background. They're all pretty plain. I also think that a lot of the location choices were fairly obvious. So the film takes place in California, Santa Monica, and so they go to Santa Monica Boulevard Pier. I don't know. I don't live in California, so if we got any California listeners, please correct me. But the main spot in Santa Monica, the boardwalk area, that was a choice. They go to Boston. First of all, the character goes to Harvard, the collegeiest of colleges, and particularly if you're going to be in Boston, that's the college of Boston. And so he gets into Harvard. They go to Harvard. That's one of the locations. They're touring around. They go to the Red Sox stadium. So it's just like very obvious choices as far as the locations go. I wish there had been a little more creativity there. As for the cinematography, so this is getting into some of those stylistic choices. This movie is really all over the places with the choices that it makes. There are some scenes where, so this is kind of bleeding into the editing as well, but like silhouettes of characters are in the background while characters are doing things. The dancing montages are just so like hyper stylized, and there's scenes where there's a dance going on, and it's like a slow dance. And it's really romantic out of nowhere. The beginning of the film is super chaotic with all of the quick camera pans and like the title credits within those camera movements are just so chaotic and all over the place. So each like section of a stylistic choice doesn't feel like it matches the last one, and because it's also being paired with these like more grounded, realistic moments, all of these scenes feel like they're separate from each other. Like, it doesn't flow very well. The pacing is like fine. Like I said, it's way too long. But it's not like it gets a little bit boring at times, but particularly towards the end. But within the first like hour and a half, it's not like boring. It's just odd. And so because the pacing isn't that bad, saying that the scenes don't match up very well is much more of a stylistic decision or just a stylistic like observation. So nothing just seems to match very well, which I thought was weird. As far as the sound goes, the soundtrack is pretty like typical for a movie like this. It's these like pretty well-known pop songs from a couple years back, which I have to imagine cost a lot of money, and I wish that that money had maybe gone elsewhere to up the production, like the production design budget a little bit more. Because they also, like, one thing I noticed too, they didn't pay for the Ghostbusters logo. They dress up as the Ghostbusters, and then they don't say it ever, and then there's also no Ghostbusters logo on their costumes. So they didn't want to spend money there, but they did spend money on all these songs, which don't really add to the movie at all. And also the score, is very typical of a movie like this that tells you exactly what you're supposed to be feeling. Like, there's no nuance as far as the score versus the scene playing out at hand. So just no variety there as well. So I just feel like the directing here was kind of phoning it in a little bit compared to the first one. He did write and direct this one as well as the first one. And the first one I think was a bit more fun. There's a bit more just like interesting things going on. And I don't even really like the first one that much. I just think that it's like better than this one. And because of the fact that the first Kissing Booth maybe had a little bit of something to prove, it needed to be at the very least successful for Netflix to give it a sequel. And so now that it has a sequel and at least a little bit of a fan base or just a known market for who's going to be watching it, it just felt like the whole movie was kind of phoning it in and didn't really get like a second pass at the screening or the script. I know that's an exaggeration, of course it did, but it just feels like there could have been a little bit more effort that was put into it to cut things down, just take another look at it overall. I'm also a bit confused as to who the target audience is here, because it seems like it's a little juvenile. It feels like a middle school or elementary schooler's interpretation of what high school is, which there's not a bad thing there. I think that's kind of fun, like looking at it that way. And when you're younger, it's fun to watch those types of movies, but also, so that seems like it would be the target audience for me. But then there's also these pretty overt sexual references and like legitimate, sexual scenes that just feel a little bit out of place and also completely unnecessary if that is your target audience. So I was just a little bit confused. It's too juvenile to be for like the high school age demographic, but it's also a little bit too risque, I think, for like a middle school, elementary school audience. Like the sweet spot here I think would be like 7th to 9th maybe. But I don't know. I'm sure that was taken into account from the people who are marketing this movie. But even still, it just seemed a little bit of an odd decision to put both those two things in the film. So I was not really a big fan of the Kissing Booth 2. I wanted to be. I wanted this. So this is a guilty pleasure episode. I wanted this to like be a guilty pleasure. Unfortunately, it didn't end up being so. So I'm going to give this film a solid 2 out of 10. I really didn't enjoy it all that much. There's not a lot of positive aspects in the film overall. I think it should have been shorter. I think there should have been a little more effort and intensity and just maybe even like corniness, tongue-in-cheek in the film. But that's the Kissing Booth 2. Can't say I recommend it. I would recommend the Kissing Booth over it, but I would also recommend a couple other films that I'll be talking about later on in this episode. So I'll be talking about 10 Things I Hate About You, which is my weekly watch, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is my weekly recommendation, and then stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about my top 5 guilty pleasure films of all time. And right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review. What did I just review? Kissing Booth 2. I reviewed The Kissing Booth 2. Already forgot about it. That's how much I like that movie. Now I'll be talking about 10 things I hate about you, which is my weekly watch. Then I'll be talking about The Amazing Spider-Man 2. A lot of numbers in these films today. And then finally, stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my top 5 guilty pleasures of all time. So now is 10 Things I Hate About You, which is a movie that I was very excited to watch. It's been on my watch list for a very long time. Never got the chance to watch it. It's a movie that I kind of expected to like, and I will say up front that I liked it a lot. I thought it was very, very good. And so it follows 2 siblings, Kat and Bianca. Well, it follows a bunch of different people, but the main premise is that Bianca is the younger sibling, Kat is the older sibling, and Bianca is not allowed to date until Kat starts dating somebody. And so Cameron, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, wants to date Bianca, and so he tries to get Patrick, played by Heath Ledger, to date Kat, played by Julia Stiles, so that he can date Bianca. So it's a very Shakespearean premise of a twisted romance story, and it's Shakespearean because it's based on a Shakespeare show. It's based on The Taming of the Shrew, which is a very interesting aspect to go with. I definitely like that idea. As you know, I'm a very big fan of Clueless, and that is my biggest comparison for this film. So I'll probably be kind of comparing it throughout this entire review, which I feel a little bit bad about, but it's just they're very similar movies, and it's definitely my way of kind of understanding this film for sure. And this one came out in 1999, whereas Clueless came out in 1995. So this one definitely feels like a response to Clueless in a way. But this is a very famous movie. This is a very big movie. It's a very big, like, teen romance movie, very romantic, very fun, very silly. And so not necessarily a guilty pleasure. I think it's a very well-respected film, but it does kind of fall into that category of like silly romance, silly like high school romance, flirty films. And so I thought it'd be a fun movie to watch today, and I wanted an excuse to watch it. So starting off with the screenplay and the plot, everything is very well connected. So Shakespeare shows, I'm a fairly big Shakespeare fan, actually. I don't know much about The Taming of the Shrew. I think I've seen it once, so I won't try and be an expert on Taming the Shrew, but I will say that Shakespeare is known for these large, complex plots that kind of involve a lot of interpersonal drama, interpersonal relationships, and that's mainly where the conflict comes in. And so that obviously translates here, and I think everything is connected really, really nicely, and everything is laid out fairly nicely. There's a really great sort of dispersion of each plot line going on, because there's a couple different plot lines, but they all are kind of like the same goal. They kind of all involve the same people and the same thing, but the character dispersion between who we're watching at what time is really well laid out, so we really get a good understanding of the plot as it's going along, so nothing ever gets too complicated. We always have a really good understanding of where these characters are. We also have a really good understanding of their motivations all of the time. So this kind of goes along with the acting. Probably should have said this second so I could segue into it, but the acting is just really strong here, and because the script is also very strong and we get a good sense of where these characters are at in the screenplay, and then we also just get to see how talented these young actors are. As you can tell, the cast grew up to be very, very big overall. And so we really get a sense of what these characters' motivations are in every scene. We're never really wondering, because teenagers sometimes can be kind of rash, and don't really know what their motivation is just in general. Like, it's just a time of angst and confusion and rebellion, like, of course. And so it might be hard for an audience to understand what the motivation is, but we really get a good sense of what it is pretty much the entire film, which I really, really like. There's also some really, like, fun Shakespeare references in here. They're kind of riddled throughout, but they're subtle enough that they're, like, not thrown in your face. There's one character who's obsessed with William Shakespeare, so, like, that's kind of a fun nod. It's just, like, kind of silly. Silly is the word of the day. I use that word a lot, actually. But here it works really good, really well today. But so there's that, of course. That one's a little bit more blatant than the rest of them. There's also a couple times where characters will say lines that are very old Englishy, so they're ripped kind of directly from Taming of the Shrew, but characters will be pretty quick to call them out for it. So I think that's always really fun. And it's usually said in like a sarcastic tone, so it definitely adds to it. I like that part a lot. They also go to Padua High, which is where the show, the script takes place. So yeah, it's a fun little nod there. There's also some really distinct characters in this film. So because of the fact that there's like all these different relationships going on, it's nice that every character has a really distinct set of ideals and personality traits, and you really can't confuse anybody for another character, which is definitely a really smart way to go. And that brings us to those characters. So the acting in this film is very strong. The directing here is also really strong, so I'll get to that specifically, but I think that translates to how strong all of these actors are. The chemistry is obviously really nice. This is not the first film, but the first like major film for a lot of these actors, and all of them, of course, grew up to be very talented. Were very talented then, but grew up to be very famous for their talent. I think the thing that I like the most here is that the performances are really not too over the top. So in a movie like Clueless, it's a bit more stylistic, it's a bit more surreal, and so the performances are going to be a bit larger than life. In this one, it, I think, prides itself in being a bit more down to earth, a bit more grounded than some of those other teen romance films, and that kind of comes across in the acting. The acting here is really not too over the top, but it's also just, like, crazy enough to be a teenager. Like, it's just odd and a little bit kind of like intense for teenagehood, but not too intense to become theatrical, even though it is Shakespeare, not theatrical in the sense of like the actual acting of the film. And so I think everyone has those really clear motivations that translate in a way that is not overtly like really thrown in our face because of how over the top those emotions might be or those motivations might be, but is just like really a credit to how talented these kids are in this film. I think it's fantastic. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's one of my favorite actors, and I think he's great. But I think the standout here really is Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles. So Julia Stiles, I think, is my favorite character here. Kat Stratford is a phenomenal character, way ahead of her time, first of all. I think she has some really great lines and just some like really great character moments. And then I also think Heath Ledger has some really real moments, some really great opening moments with like he's supposed to be like the scary character that everyone is afraid of. So he has some really great moments in the beginning of the film, but then kind of like deteriorating, both his character and Julia Stiles' character to really see who they are underneath. And it's told overtly to us kind of in like the end of the second act, beginning of the third act. But not like really in your face. It's just subtle enough, and we've also come to understand them well enough through Show Don't Tell, that it doesn't feel out of place here. It feels like these are two characters that do really actually want to get to know each other. And I think their relationship is really cute. I really like this relationship. I think it's just like, I don't know, they're both well suited for each other. I'm a sap, you know that. But I just think that this is a really nice relationship, and the acting between the two, both separate and apart, I think are really, really great. Allison Janney has a really fun performance here too. Allison Janney's been in some really great movies. I think she's a really phenomenal actress, and she's really only in the beginning of this film, but it's just a very fun bit role that I think is just a really enjoyable moments of the film. The first scene is what kind of made me aware of this. I meant to say this in my screenplay notes, that the scenes tie together really nicely. Like, motifs or moments that are introduced in the beginning of a scene will tie in really nicely at the end of the scene. So that's made pretty apparent within like the first scene of the film in the guidance counselor's office. So I really think that that's just a great example of how carefully put together this film is. So moving on to the production design. The production design on the surface seems like it might be a little bit weaker than some other films. Again, going back to Clueless is super kind of like stylistic, and the colors are very apparent, and the costuming is really larger than life. Here, everything is really, really simple most of the time. So barring a few exceptions, everything is really plain. And I think that's kind of because of the fact that the story is so much more complex and lavish, and the fact that these characters are so distinct, that it really makes us focus particularly on the character dynamics and the plot at hand. So nothing is like distracting us from that most of the time. I'll talk about the sound in a little bit. That's kind of the only distraction for me. But overall, there's no moments that feel like they're being taken away from in the production design that like take away from the story, which I think is really, really smart. There's a lot of like human tones, like a lot of browns and tans and whites. So that's just, I think, a stylistic choice to kind of emulate maybe what you would expect from a Shakespearean show, with a lot like warmer, desaturated colors. But I think that those like the lack of lavish costumes is actually so we can focus on the complexity of the story and the characters, which I think is really smart. And there are a couple like costumes that make not quite the side characters, but like the characters that we don't even actually see, but like the rest of the high schoolers stand out for their like social groups, the social dynamics. And so those costumes are a bit larger, and I think that's obviously important to show who they are without the nuance of dialogue or actual screen time. So where you can see that there was actually some care taken into those costumes, and that the lack of kind of intensity for the main characters' costumes is not because that was something that was like a weak point for them. It was actually a clear decision to be made for this film. There's also some huge, phenomenal sets in this movie that really make it stand out from some other films. I think like nowadays, a lot of films kind of emulate this style of like really big high schools, like really big proms, which are fairly unrealistic. So this one seems to like, the high school takes place in like a castle, like an actual castle, which is definitely reminiscent of what you might see in Shakespearean times, like in old Europe, I guess. So that definitely serves a purpose, but it's also just this like big sets that kind of reflect the emotions and intensity of the actual characters, which I think is kind of cool. So I like those sets. I think that they're a really great way for the film to stand out. That also translates to the cinematography. The cinematography, everything feels big. So obviously there are moments between two characters where it's like much more intimate, and those are pretty simple two shots, but any scene where the setting plays a key role, so whether it be the high school, the football field, or the prom, those sets and those shots, particularly the establishing shots, feel very large. And that, I think, also translates to how large these emotions may feel for these young kids, which I think is wonderful, a wonderful little touch. I think also the cinematography, there are some really cool tracking shots that I think are less of a narrative decision and more of just a way for the pacing to be really tight. So I'll like elaborate on this when I talk about the editing, but everything is pretty quick here, so the pacing is really tight, really nice, and so the fact that these tracking shots are really just to move the dialogue along, and get us to experience the environment that they're in, and also the focus on just the well-rehearsed dialogue, well-acted dialogue. So I think it's kind of cool that that's definitely a distinction from some other films that are like this. There's also some fun creative shots, particularly towards the end of the film. There's one shot that I really, really like, where these flyers are coming down from the top of the staircase and the camera's rotating, and there's a really like upbeat song playing, and the flyers are neon yellow, so they pop from the rest of the set. So I think there are definitely some creative shots, that one being one of my favorites, if not my favorite from the entire movie. So getting to that editing, everything is paced really nicely here. The dialogue is super well rehearsed, super tight. And sometimes where dialogue feels really, or like you can tell that it's well rehearsed, the genuineness of the emotions feel like they're kind of stripped away. And so you might feel like the reactions are a bit more scripted than they should be. And here, because again, the acting is so strong, the emotions feel like they are coming about really naturally. And this feels like dialogue that feels supernatural for these characters because of how well rehearsed it is. And it just keeps the pacing going along really nicely. The film is a tight hour 37. And so I think that's just a really solid way to make a teen film, that this is sort of like the exact correct amount of time. I think the only bit of pacing that could have been improved upon, most of the scenes end with a joke, like a little stinger at the end of the scene. unless of course it's a big emotional scene, but most of the time there's a little bit of a joke at the end, and I think sometimes the joke lingers a bit too long and the scenes maybe could have cut to the next one within cut like 2 or 3 seconds off of it. And it doesn't ruin the pacing, which is nice. It's just a little bit of a nitpick that I think the scenes would have been a bit tighter if they had cut a little bit of that dead space out of the end. So I had said that the sound was a little bit distracting, and people might disagree with me on this. There's a lot of music in this film. The soundtrack is pretty dense, and it's a lot of like 90s music that's very popular, very well known, and I think that can be a little bit distracting. So I think a soundtrack should have a balance of songs that are well known, songs that aren't. Most of the soundtrack is pretty well known. And there's also a lot of it. There's a lot of music cues in here, and a lot of those emotional moments or just like narrative beats are kind of punctuated with a soundtrack as opposed to an actual score. And so I just thought that maybe a few of those cues should have been taken out or been a little bit subtler. I think that's more of a personal preference. I just think that the music can be a little bit more distracting than it should be, because there's just so much of it, and so much iconic songs in here. I mean, they like Bad Reputation by Joan Jett plays, which is the theme song for Freaks and Geeks, and I can never not think it's Freaks and Geeks. So that really got me in like the 90s mood, because that's like a late 90s television show. But I just think the music was a little bit distracting. But that being said, the themes of each scene and the themes of the song do complement each other really well. So I don't think it's unnecessary by any means. I just think that it should have been a little bit stripped back maybe a little bit more. So then moving on to the directing, this film is directed by Jill Junger. So I think the pacing here, I had said a little earlier, is really nice. She moves the story along really well. So I had kind of divvied up the fact that each character gets the right amount of time within the story, and it bounces between them really well. And I think that's a credit to just how well put together this film is for this director. You never lose track of the plot. You never lose track of any specific character for too long. And so I think that's just like the amount of just care taken to this film, the amount of like thought overall. And so this is very competently, very cleverly directed, because all of these things are not thrown in your face, but they're definitely there and fairly apparent if you're really looking for them. I think she also creates some really careful relationships and some really kind relationships. So these characters are pretty intense, being teenagers, and the intricacies of what's going on can definitely be misconstrued in certain ways. It is a movie, so it's not going to be abiding by necessarily the same rules, but you can definitely see that like in high school, this is kind of how things are. You're like, don't want to tell people you have a crush on them. You want to just like find things out. You don't want anybody to know. And this whole film kind of centers around secrecy and different plots, that way. And so I think that the actual relationships, when taken time to embrace them without the kind of like narrative plot going on, and just the personal relationships between two characters, are really, really sympathetically shown. And that's a strength to both the acting and the directing. So the relationships and the chemistry here is really nicely put together. So I really enjoyed this. I think this is a really wonderful movie. I knew it was a movie that I was going to like. It's definitely just my kind of film, but I definitely would recommend this for anybody. It's a really lighthearted, fun romantic comedy with a lot of like really nice nuances and intricacies that you don't find in a lot of these rom-coms, particularly of this era. So I'm going to give this film a strong 8 out of 10, even a soft 9 out of 10. So I really loved 10 Things I Hate About You. It's streaming for free on Disney+. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend you go check it out. If you have seen it, find somebody you enjoy being with and watch it with them. It's definitely an enjoyable watch. I would assume even on a second watch. So that's 10 Things I Hate About You. Next up, I'll be reviewing my weekly recommendation, which is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I promise I will explain. And then finally, my top 5 guilty pleasures of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given reviews of The Kissing Booth 2, 10 Things I Hate About You, and now I'm going to be reviewing my weekly recommendation, which is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then finally, stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my top 5 guilty pleasure films of all time. So this is one of those guilty pleasure films. I know a lot of people dislike this movie, so I'll explain why I like it so much, why I think it just gets way too much hate than it actually deserves. But I also think that guilty pleasures are a fun little topic for me because I don't really believe in guilty pleasures. I understand the concept completely, and I try my best to not believe in it, but some things I'll shield from people because it might be a little bit cringy or whatnot. But I think if you like something, you like something. I know that I'm a reviewer. I know that it's my job to tell you what I think is good and what isn't. But if you disagree with me, I'm not going to tell you that you should like something that I found very good. I just think that you should ultimately enjoy what you enjoy and not feel shame over it, particularly something that might give you so much joy. So that's one of these films, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. You probably know this by now. I'm a very big superhero fan as well as a very big Spider-Man fan. So my favorite film is Spider-Verse. So this obviously isn't going to top that. But I do think that this may be blasphemous, but this is probably my favorite live-action Spider-Man movie. I really love this film. A little bit of context. I had seen The Amazing Spider-Man in theaters. I didn't really like it at all. I thought it was a little bit too dark, a little bit too angsty. The plot was a little bit too confused for me, particularly at the time. So I had very low expectations for this film. I also just hadn't seen many of the trailers. I didn't know much about it. And it really kind of shocked me with the direction that the plot went, the overall tone of it all. So I had very low expectations. I had seen it in theaters with one of my best friends. So definitely have that in mind when I talk about it. But I do think there are some aspects of this film that are quite good. And although I can understand why people dislike this film, please understand why I do like it. I think there are some really nice aspects of it. And I just think ultimately it's a pretty fun, harmless movie. Although maybe not harmless, you can say that it killed the whole Sony Spider-Man thing. So sorry about that. But I think it's just a fun, enjoyable movie that I would really like to talk about. So that's what I'm going to do. It's funny though, because I may not rave about this film nearly as much as I do most of my weekly recommendations, because I do know that there are some fairly poor aspects of this film overall, but I will talk about a lot of the stuff that I really like. And of course, media is subjective, and ultimately I just think this is a really fun film, and I really enjoy it. So starting with the screenplay, that's probably the weakest aspect of the film overall. It's a criticism that it gets a lot, but there are a lot of villains in here, so the plot becomes a little bit convoluted if you're not really paying attention. I do think that thematically it really knows what it wants to say, and I think that the characters of Electro and Green Goblin definitely complement each other really well, and narratively are tied pretty darn well. So I think there's a lot of setup, a lot of exposition that maybe could have been cut out or trimmed down a little bit. But overall, I do think that these two plot lines connect much better than most films that have more than one villain, but I can understand the criticism that it's a little bit convoluted. I think that you do have to be really paying attention to the plot overall. I realize now that I have not explained the plot, but basically what you need to know is that it's a Spider-Man movie. It's a save the day type film. It focuses particularly on Oscorp as a company kind of corrupting New York City, and its youngest protege, Harry Osborn, as well as the character Max Dillon, who ends up becoming Electro, a main foe of Spider-Man. So it's just kind of one of those, like, gotta save the day superhero plots. It's very Spider-Man-esque. So there's not too much intricacy that I can really say involving the actual plot of the film. But although the plot may not be the strongest aspect of the film, I do think that the tone of the film is actually very strong here. So this is said very often for many different superhero movies, and it means different things when talking about different films, but this film really feels comic book-y to me. I think it balances the tones really nicely. It bounces kind of between really intense action and emotion to really silly, fun quips and just lighthearted character moments that are connected to friendship or love or whatnot. And I think it balances those two tones really nicely, particularly for a film that went through so many different studio interferences and different cuts and like scenes on the cutting room floor and plot directions. So because of that, the fact that the themes and tones of the film are balanced so nicely, I think is really very impressive. And I think none of those tones feel jarring. It has a really nice steady progression going into the really high intensity and emotional moments, but there are also scenes that are a bit more intense and a bit more action packed and have a bit higher stakes than you might expect for that early in a film. And when it goes between that and a lighter side of things, I think it does so really nicely. The transition is very smooth, particularly for a character like Spider-Man that is just so steeped in lore and has so many different iterations that go between really like high stakes, really emotional and tragic moments to just being your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and helping out the neighborhood of New York City. And so that's another one of my favorite moments in this film, is that the first Amazing Spider-Man film, I think because it was trying to really separate itself from the Raimi trilogy and kind of a response to the Nolan Batman trilogy, it's definitely a lot darker, a lot edgier, and Spider-Man can go through different iterations. I'm definitely not against different interpretations of characters. I think that's a really great way to move things, particularly in a studio system that might not allow for that very often. So I'm not going to criticize that. But one of my personal favorite aspects of Spider-Man is just how he's somebody trying to do the best thing, really trying to help out the neighborhood, and that's why I just like the moniker of Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. And you don't really see any of that in the first film, but here you get to see moments of him helping out just normal people and just being a kind person and hero. And so I think that is something that I find really nice in the screenplay here. Because of some of those scenes and the fact that it bounces between tones so quickly, I don't think it takes itself too seriously, much like that first Amazing Spider-Man movie. I think that it is having fun the entire time, and although it has those emotional moments, it definitely moves away from those, so you can still have a really good time. And it may not have as high stakes in certain moments, but I just think overall it really kind of knows what it is. At least the director knows the vision and knows what it is. So I think that seeps through, and you really can tell that it's not taking itself all that seriously. The one downside from the screenplay, I think, is that there are a couple of subplots that I feel like are a bit unnecessary, particularly the subplot with Peter Parker's dad, Mr. Parker. I just don't think that that's necessary. I think it definitely dials the movie back. It suffers in a way that it really shouldn't. It shouldn't really be about that at all. It should be much more focused on Peter Parker. And this film is 220. I think it definitely could have been shaved down by 20, even 30 minutes if that subplot had been cut out, and the pacing would have been a lot nicer. So I think that this movie is much stronger, and I think people would have liked it a lot better if that subplot had been taken out. But that's really the only downside from the screenplay overall. It's a pretty large downside, so I can admit that for sure. But if you kind of ignore that aspect of the film, most of the rest of it is pretty fun and pretty darn perfect in my mind. The acting here is really great. It has just a really, really strong cast with Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone and Jamie Foxx, Dane DeHaan, Paul Giamatti. It just has a really wonderful cast, and all of the actors are super strong and really bring their A game here for a movie where they're just getting such a high paycheck and really could have been much more lackluster than they were. They're definitely super campy and comic booky in a way that didn't happen in the first Andrew Garfield film, and is definitely a different type of camp than the Raimi trilogies. A lot more, just a lot sillier and a lot more kind of over the top in ways. So I like that. It definitely translates well to kind of adapting a comic book, particularly the villains. One of my favorite things about Spider-Man is that the villains kind of just want to kill Spider-Man. Like they don't actually like have any motivations. They just don't like Spider-Man, and that comes through here, particularly for Jamie Foxx's character Electro. I also think that Andrew Garfield is one of my favorite. Well, I can't say one because there's only a few, but I honestly want to say that he's my favorite Spider-Man. I really like the weight that he brings to this performance, as well as the fun, lighthearted side. I think there's definitely like a severe sense of conflict and emotion within him that you don't see nearly as much. You see it, I think, for sure in Tobey Maguire's interpretation, but we're just not given the chance to see it yet, I think, in Tom Holland's interpretation, given the canon of the story. But here we get both sides of Spider-Man in a way that I don't think we had seen before, and I don't think we've seen since. And I think here he's really shining. And I think his chemistry with Emma Stone, Gwen Stacy, is also really nice here. Mark Webb, you guys also know that I like Mark Webb a lot, given that I like 500 Days of Summer and this movie. He just knows how to direct chemistry and direct relationships, and so the Gwen Stacy Peter Parker relationship is a relationship they're really building up in this film for a pretty distinct reason that I think everybody knows about by this point, and even if you don't, it's pretty well foreshadowed in this film. That's another thing, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this film, which I actually don't see as a downside. I think it's not it's not subtle, and I don't think it's trying to be subtle. I think it's just a clear choice, very strong motifs, and I don't particularly mind it. Maybe some people do, but the relationship here that they're building up, that they're definitely like making very apparent that they're building it up, is really nice, really cute. They just have a really great dynamic. They have really wonderful chemistry, and so I think that both Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker here are kind of on their A game. And the strongest aspect of the film overall. One of my favorite parts of this film is the production design, because I think it's just so much stronger than that first film. Here, I think this is probably, I mean, it's debatable among a lot of fans, but I think it's not a hot take. This is the best live-action Spider-Man suit that we've seen. It's just like very aesthetically pleasing, very colorful, pretty comic accurate, but definitely functional as well. And the bright colors of the costume also exist in the world. The colors in this film are much brighter, somewhat oversaturated at points, which I think makes it just much more aesthetically pleasing, very similar to a comic book. I think that there's a lot of like blues here that I think would look really beautiful. The juxtaposition between the blues for Spider-Man and the blues for Electro, I think, are fairly distinct. I think the character design for the villains are also fairly strong. They're fairly different from the comic books, which I really like, particularly Green Goblin. Looks very different, but I think it just kind of works in reference to the rest of the world. Electro is based on a very different interpretation than many styles of Electro, and I think it works really well here. The visual effects look beautiful as well. I also think the production design uses New York really well. New York feels like a character. Building up in the first film, New York is a very just distinct aspect of Spider-Man's character, and so having in the first film us really see New York kind of back this character, back this guy, and really be on his side and really help him out when he needs it. In this film, he doesn't need that help nearly as much as he did in the first film, and so they're really here to cheer him on, which is apparent in a lot of those big scenes, and they really trust him and really know that he's going to get the job done. So I really like that New York has his back here, and I think that that's pretty well reflected in the set pieces of the film using New York. Even the small kind of like suburb areas, quieter sections of New York, in a really relevant way for the rest of the film. I had said that there were bright colors. That kind of translates to the CGI, the color grading, or the cinematography. The color grading is really nice here. I do think the CGI is beautiful. I don't think there's really, it looks definitely fairly cartoony, but it doesn't look out of place in the world. I think it's gorgeous. There are some gorgeous shots. The beginning, the first 10 minutes of the film with the score and the CGI and the costuming is fantastic, and the climax looks beautiful. So I think those aspects are really, really nice, and the CGI is just incorporated really well into this film. I also think that there's some really cool slow-mo effects in the cinematography that I don't always like, but I think they highlight Spider-Man's character, as well as his motivations and desires, and it just kind of like highlights the action in a really nice way. That sometimes action can get kind of lost in the shuffle and we don't really see what's going on, and so that slow motion, particularly for characters that move so quickly, is really helpful in seeing what's actually going on and creating these really like painting-esque frames, which I think is really great. That kind of translates to the pacing and the editing as well. The action scenes are really well paced. They're really quick. They're pretty well dispersed as far as where they are in relevance to the rest of the film. So I really like how quick those action scenes are, how just intense and enjoyable they are, and the heightened emotions of each action scene. So the first one is very like light and quippy and fun. And then by the end we get really dark, and then we kind of come full circle towards the end of the film. I think that the one thing, like I had said earlier, is those B plots, they kind of screw up the pacing a little bit, but there's also enough like cool moments, exciting moments throughout the film that it doesn't completely ruin the actual pacing of the film. It just kind of like trips it up a little bit, and if those B plots had been cut out, it would have been a lot better. I would like to see a cut without those B plots, because it doesn't add anything to the movie, but that's just me. The score here is fantastic. It's done by Hans Zimmer, who is obviously a very seasoned veteran in the film industry, has created some phenomenal scores. And here the motif of electricity and time is incorporated into the score really nicely. So there's a lot of creative choices as to what instruments are being used to reference both those two motifs and the characters. And I think it also incorporates a lot of inner dialogue. That's fairly subtle if you're watching it for the first time, but if you hear it more than once, you can definitely pick up on. So I think the score here is really gorgeous and accents scenes much nicer than it did in the first one, and even nicer than a lot of superhero movies that I've seen, barring a few exceptions for certain like really iconic scores. I do think there are some silly song choices in this film. There's a Philip Phillips song that I think a lot of people make fun of that is just an odd montage, but I really like it. I think it's just goofy and kind of dumb and over the top, and so some people like might find that weird, but I think because I don't think it's taking itself all that seriously, I like those song choices. I think it's just kind of fun, shows the age of the characters, shows maybe some of the inner monologue of the characters, so I don't really particularly mind it. Mark Webb is really just kind of an expert at putting things together tonally in ways that they don't seem to be working. So for 500 Days of Summer, scenes that jump between times but then end up flowing really nicely, he just creates a really nice flow in this film as well. So I think that he just really knows what he's doing. He balances those tones and he balances characters really nicely, and I think he has a very clear message and theme that he wants to put out into the world, involving like personal relationships and friendships and personal responsibility, which is obviously a big part of Spider-Man's character. So I really, really like this film. I know that a lot of people don't, so this is probably one of my biggest guilty pleasures, but I do recommend you watching it. I think it's just such a fun, enjoyable movie. I think it's a fun group movie. So I love The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I'm going to give this film a strong 8 out of 10 just because it's one of my favorites. So that's The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I hope you enjoyed that review. I'm now going to be talking about my top 5 guilty pleasures, excluding this one, of all time. But right now, we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given reviews of The Kissing Booth 2, 10 Things I Hate About You, and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and right now I'm going to give my top 5 guilty pleasure films of all time, because I thought this was kind of a little bit of a goofy episode, and I think guilty pleasures is a really fun topic. So I'm also going to keep things a little bit shorter, because I know that this episode is running a little bit long. So I'm going to just try and keep things concise, give you my list, but here are some of my favorites. Here are some films that I really, really enjoy that may not be as critically acclaimed. So the first one, number 5, is Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I am a big fan of classic, literature, classic theater. So I knew Pride and Prejudice fairly well. I think that the story it's not my favorite story, but it has kind of a little bit of a soft spot for me. And I also have a big soft spot for gore and monster characters and horror, and I think that I haven't finished the book. I had read parts of the book, so I feel bad, but it's just such a fun concept. Just the fact that a story like that, because it exists in the public domain, people can do whatever their mind wants creatively, and so I think this is just a really great example of it. It's insanely intense. I do kind of wish that it had been given an R rating. It was only a PG-13, so some of that gore that maybe would have added to the film is taken out. But I don't necessarily think it takes all that much away from it. I just think it's really silly. It kind of it's a classic story for people who don't like that classic style of storytelling. It throws all of the purity of the original story out the window. And it's just a really crazy, fun example of copyright, public domain, storytelling, and just the juxtaposition of different genres that kind of come together in ways that may not work super well, but is just really enjoyable to watch. So it's just a fun, over the top, crazy idea that I think translates to screen fairly well. And although I wish it had been rated R, I think it's a really fun movie, and that's why it's number 5. Number 4 is a movie that is streaming on Netflix right now, and I hesitate to recommend it because I think that it's not necessarily the most appropriate for a lot of reasons, but it's called Emo the Musical. It's a movie out of Australia. It's kind of a cult classic for anyone that's heard of it. It is a musical, you heard that right, and it's about the rivalry between emos and Christians in a certain high school. Oh my god, it's so silly and weird, and a lot of my friends hate it, but a lot of my friends, we just kind of watch it and make fun of it. It's the strangest movie I have ever seen. It's such a fun group watch. It has no idea what it is. I don't necessarily know what story it's trying to tell, but some of the songs are bangers. Some of them are fantastic. Jesus Would Have Been an Emo, beautiful. Oh, Icing on the Cake, a phenomenal song. It's just so silly, and the plot points, the narrative is crazy and shocking, and you never know which way it's gonna go. It's super surprising. So it's just a crazy film that I think is such a fun movie to watch with friends. So I really recommend that you go check this out. Not many people have heard of it. It's definitely an indie movie, that's gaining a little bit of a cult following, and it's really, really enjoyable. Number 3 is my least conventional choice on this list because it's not a guilty pleasure for how silly and weird and maybe even bad that it is. It's called It's Such a Beautiful Day. It's a film by a filmmaker named Don Hertzfeldt, who's an animator and storyteller who does most of his projects almost by himself. And he likes to tell very human stories in a very simple but stylistic animation style. He has a short film that won an Oscar that got really big on YouTube a while back called Rejected. And he's just such a creative filmmaker. I picked this one in this list because it's just really raw and kind of a difficult watch. It's sporadic, it's all over the place, but it's very human in the way that it shows its inner monologue and examples of mental illness and doubt. It's just such a wonderful movie in the way that it portrays what it is to be a thoughtful human being. It's very difficult to watch. It's jarring in ways that you really wouldn't expect from animation. I just think that Don Hertzfeldt is one of my favorite filmmakers out there right now. He has one of my favorite he has my favorite short film of all time called The World of Tomorrow, or World of Tomorrow. So I wanted to put this one on the list because I wanted to make people aware of it. It definitely is a little bit of a harder watch. It's not nearly as fun as the other ones on this list. And it's definitely not a movie that I would show to somebody without first like knowing them or preparing them for it. So that's why I would put it on a guilty pleasures list. It's a harder watch than a lot of these other ones, but it is still a really, really wonderful film and just a really great filmmaker. So that's why it's number 3. Number 2 is one that people also don't really agree with me on. I think it's a much smarter movie than people give it credit for. Whether that's intentional or not, it might have been completely unintentional how smart of a movie I think that it is. But it's called The Babysitter. It's on Netflix. It's a Netflix original. It stars a lot of like influencer people, relevant social media actors who are probably my least favorite part of the film. They're the ones that don't feel nearly as self-aware as the rest of the film. I think it feels very self-aware. It's really over the top stylistically. There's some really crazy choices that are being made that just kind of enhance how crazy the actual story is and how silly the story is. The humor is very tongue-in-cheek. It knows what type of humor works well in sort of a horror satire like this. It's also the director of All Star by Smash Mouth, the music video, so that's a plus. The acting is really campy and corny, but it's also like very strong. The relationships are really strong in this film. The comedic timing is really great. Robbie Amell stands out to me the most. He's a very strong comedic actor in this movie, and I just think there's some really great comedy moments, some really great like gore moments. There's some really excellent deaths if you're a horror movie fan. So I think The Babysitter is much smarter than people give it credit for. Again, whether that was intended or not is beyond me, and I don't think that it really matters. I think it's enjoyable, and I think that it's fairly self-aware. So it's one of those movies that just feel like kind of a horror parody satire of slasher flicks that I think works really well and is a genre that I really, really like. So that's why it's number 2. I think it's like very fun. And finally, number 1, people might not consider this one a guilty pleasure. It's relatively well established. I wanted to put it in here because I think some of the latest film in the series definitely kind of it tries to explain things and it kind of ruins that first one, and it's also a little bit of a more difficult watch because of the style that it's being shown in, but that movie is Cloverfield. If you count it as a horror movie, it's the first horror movie I ever watched. It's done in first person kind of found footage shaky cam, which can be a hard watch for people, which is one of the reasons why I put it on this list. Might not be a first watch that I show people, but I think that the personal relationships between the characters in the film are really well crafted, particularly in a movie that should be focusing on the monster but doesn't give us a monster reveal until very late. It creates the horror and the intensity by not showing us what's really going on. So it's just got some of those great characters. It keeps its secrets really nicely. And I do think the camera work, even though it's found footage and a little bit nauseating to watch sometimes, creates some really great framings and some really great moments. And putting in the subplot of the taping over another nice moment, I think creates some really nice narrative thematic juxtaposition between the two events that are going on in the story. So I think it's one of my favorite films almost ever, and maybe it's not a guilty pleasure for some people, but I do think that there are some pretty relevant cases to be made why it might not be the most palatable movie for certain people, and that's why I put it on the list, but I put it at number 1 because it is my favorite of the bunch. So those are my top 5 guilty pleasures. I think they're all really fun movies. I think that people should have as many guilty pleasures as they want. I think you should like exactly what you want to like. If you agree with me, disagree with me on certain things that I say movies on this podcast, please let me know. Please tell me. Tweet us at GSMC_movies. That's the account that we're checking the most. I would love to see some of your guys' opinions, some of your ideas on some of the movies that we've already talked about, some of the movies that you might want us to talk about, and send us some of your guilty pleasures. What are some of your favorite movies that may not be nearly as critically acclaimed but have a really soft spot in your heart? What are some of your favorites? So that's today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun coming up with this episode, watching these movies. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review because that really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.